Why it sucked to be a prisoner of war in Assyria. Welcome, my friend. Tonight, I invite you to travel with me into a world long forgotten. A world carved into clay tablets, etched into stone reliefs, and whispered through the voices of empires, long turned to dust. Together, we will explore one of history's darkest corners, a place where conquest was glory, but captivity was suffering. Our story is called Why It Sucked to be a Prisoner of War in Assyria. Over the course of 5 chapters, you will drift slowly through the rise of the Assyrian war machine, the brutal fate of those who fell into its hands, the punishments that made this empire feared, the daily lives of captives in exile, and the enduring lessons they left behind. It is not a tale of kings and golden palaces, but of ordinary people whose misfortune was to be caught on the wrong side of Assyria's spears. As you listen, you don't need to hold on tightly to every detail. Let the rhythm of history carry you like a gentle river. The names may sound strange, the rituals unfamiliar, but they are fragments of a story that shaped the ancient world. And while your mind wanders, perhaps toward sleep, these echoes of Assyria will linger softly in the background, like distant footsteps fading into the desert night. So, settle in. Allow yourself to relax, and let's begin our journey. Chapter 1. Part 1. Assyria, the most fearsome empire of the ancient Near East. Imagine the vast land of Mesopotamia, the land between 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This fertile cradle of civilization gave rise to many powers: Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians. But none inspired as much terror as the Assyrian Empire. By the 9th century BCE, Assyria had transformed itself into the world's first great military superpower. Unlike kingdoms that rose and fell with the charisma of a single ruler, Assyria built its strength on a system, a relentless, organized machine of war. The Assyrians were known for their professional standing army, one of the earliest in history. Most ancient armies were seasonal, farmers who picked up weapons only after the harvest. But Assyria changed the rules. They trained full-time soldiers, men who lived for battle year after year. Imagine facing warriors who knew nothing else but the spear, the bow, and the chariot. The Assyrians also pioneered the use of iron weapons. While many neighbors still relied on bronze, a softer metal, easily bent or broken, the Assyrians forged swords, spears, and armor of iron, stronger, sharper, and more deadly. To give you an image, where a bronze blade might chip against a shield, an iron sword would cut straight through. And then there were the chariots. Not the light, 2-man carts you might picture from Egyptian reliefs, but heavy, 4-man war. Wagons, 1 driver, 1 shield bearer, 2 archers. Each chariot was like a moving fortress, raining arrows down on enemy lines. The thunder of horses, the creak of wheels, the whistling of arrows. This was the terrifying sound of Assyrian power. But perhaps the most chilling innovation was psychological. The Assyrians mastered the art of intimidation. They recorded their victories in brutal detail on palace walls. Scenes of enemies flayed alive, impaled on stakes, or led in chains before the king. These weren't just records. They were warnings. Every carved image whispered, "Submit or this will be your fate." For the people of the ancient Near East, war with Assyria was not just about losing land or paying tribute. It meant the possibility of losing your freedom forever, of becoming a prisoner dragged across deserts and mountains to serve a foreign master. And so we arrive at the heart of our story. To understand why it was so dreadful to be an Assyrian prisoner of war, we must first understand the immense force that captured them. A force built on iron, discipline, fear, and an endless hunger for expansion. Close your eyes and imagine the dust of the battlefield rising under horse hooves, the clash of metal on metal, the cries of defeat. Behind it all, the shadow of Assyria, stretches long and dark. For those who stood against it, capture was almost certain, and the beginning of a nightmare. Chapter 1, Part 2. How the Assyrians captured their prisoners. Picture the battlefield again, silent for a moment before the storm. The Assyrians did not simply rush forward like a reckless mob. Their army moved with chilling precision. Imagine ranks of infantry, archers in the back lines, chariots sweeping across the flanks, and siege engineers preparing their tools. Yes, siege engineers. The Assyrians were among the first to develop a specialized corps of soldiers trained to tear down walls and break city defenses. They used battering rams, massive wooden machines tipped with iron, rolled forward under protective roofs. Soldiers pushed these rams against city gates while archers rained arrows above them. If walls were too high, they built earthen ramps, piling dirt and stone until their siege towers could reach the top. To their enemies, it must have felt like fighting against an unstoppable tide. When cities finally broke, the capture of prisoners began, and this too was part of Assyrian strategy. They didn't just kill. They wanted bodies living proof of victory and human fuel for their empire. Sometimes entire populations were taken. We call this mass deportation. Imagine tens of thousands of people forced to leave their homes, chained together, walking mile after mile to a strange land. Farmers, artisans, women, children, it didn't matter. The Assyrian king wanted people as much as territory. A conquered city was not only looted, it was emptied. Its inhabitants relocated to work for Assyria. The records carved in stone tell us in unnerving detail. One king boasted, "I took their men, women, and children. I counted them as spoil. I carried them away." To the Assyrians, prisoners were statistics, numbers to be tallied, resources to be redistributed. But there was a hierarchy in captivity. High-ranking enemies, kings, generals, nobles were paraded in chains. They were trophies, symbols of humiliation. Some were executed in gruesome ways, their deaths recorded as warnings. Others were spared, forced to kneel and swear loyalty before the Assyrian king, then kept under watch like broken lions. Ordinary soldiers faced a harsher fate. Some were conscripted into the Assyrian army itself, fighting for the empire that had just destroyed their homeland. Others were marked for slavery, tied together in lines, their hands bound, collars fastened around their necks. And for civilians' families who had never held a weapon, the fate was exile. Imagine leaving behind your fields, your ancestors, graves, the walls of your hometown, and being marched hundreds of miles to a city whose language you didn't understand. For the Assyrians, this was efficient policy. For the prisoners, it was the beginning of endless suffering. Their journey did not end when the battle was over. In truth, it was only just beginning. Chapter 1, Part 3. The image of the Assyrian warrior. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it would feel like to see an Assyrian warrior approaching. Not just one, but thousands. A sea of iron and leather, moving as one. The typical Assyrian soldier was heavily armed compared to his neighbors. He wore a conical helmet, often made of bronze or iron, shaped to deflect blows. His torso was protected by lamella armoros of small iron plates laced together like fish scales. This gave both flexibility and strength, far superior to the simple leather tunics worn by most enemies. In one hand, the soldier carried a spear or an iron-tipped sword, sometimes curved, sometimes straight. In the other, he might hold a large shield, rectangular and made of thick wood, reinforced with metal. Behind him, archers carried powerful composite bows, their arrows tipped with iron. A rain of these could darken the sky before a city wall. The Assyrians were among the first to organize their army into specialized units. Heavy infantry marched with shields and spears. Light infantry skirmished with slings and javelins. Archers stood in disciplined rows, firing in volleys. Charioteers thundered forward, their horses armored with bronze face masks. And eventually, they even developed cavalry riders on horseback, faster and more mobile than any chariot could ever be. But the most frightening thing wasn't just the equipment. It was the way these soldiers carried themselves. They were trained to project fear. Reliefs carved on palace walls show lines of warriors standing tall, eyes fixed straight. Ahead, weapons gleaming. Imagine being a villager, peering from behind a crumbling wall, seeing not disorganized raiders, but an army that looked unstoppable, almost mechanical in its advance. Assyrian kings understood the power of this image. Their warriors were not just fighters. They were instruments of propaganda. Every helmet, every iron blade, every sculpted carving on a wall shouted the same message. We are the hand of the king. We are the hand of Assyria. Resistance is hopeless. Even the way prisoners were depicted in Assyrian art reinforced this. On massive stone slabs called reliefs, Assyrian soldiers are shown towering above cowering captives. The message was psychological as much as military. Look at us. Look at them. This is your future if you defy Assyria. For those unlucky enough to fall into Assyrian hands, this image was the last thing they saw before chains closed around their wrists. The warrior was not only a soldier, he was the face of domination. And so, the legend of the Assyrian War. Machine grew. To be taken prisoner by these men was to be claimed by the empire itself. Chapter 1, Part 4. Why prisoners mattered to Assyria. The Assyrians did not take prisoners out of pity. They did not spare lives because of compassion. No, every captive had a purpose. To the empire, human beings were resources, just as valuable as gold, grain, or land. Assyria built its empire on constant expansion. New territories required farmers to till the soil, artisans to craft tools, builders to raise temples, and soldiers to guard borders. Where would all this labor come from? The answer was simple. Prisoners of war. Imagine a conquered city, its gates broken, its leaders humiliated. The Assyrian army did not merely plunder its wealth, they emptied the city of people. Entire populations were uprooted and forced into exile. This practice, known by historians as mass deportation, became one of Assyria's most distinctive policies. It served several purposes at once. First, it weakened resistance. By removing people from their homeland, the Assyrians broke their ties to local land, culture, and leadership. Without familiar soil or neighbors to rally around, rebellion became nearly impossible. Second, it redistributed skills. If Assyria needed stonemasons in one city, or farmers in another, they filled the gap with deportees. The empire functioned like a giant machine, and human lives were the gears. The king himself often recorded these transfers in royal inscriptions, proudly listing how many thousands were taken and settled in new lands. Third, it displayed power. Imagine walking through Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and seeing prisoners from every corner of the known world. Men with different hairstyles, clothing, and languages. Each group was living proof of Assyria's dominance. The city itself became a museum of conquest. Even religion was involved. The Assyrians believed their god, Ashur, had chosen them to rule all nations. To bring back captives was not only practical, it was sacred duty. The more prisoners paraded before Ashur, the more it proved that the god's will was being fulfilled. And so, to be captured by Assyria was to be absorbed into something larger than yourself. The machinery of empire, the economy of conquest, the ideology of divine destiny. Whether you were a soldier, a farmer, or a child, your life no longer belonged to you. It belonged to Assyria. This was the shadow that fell over every battlefield. Those who saw the Assyrian army on the horizon knew If death did not claim them, captivity would. Chapter 2, Part 1. From battlefield to chains, the moment of capture was not always loud. Sometimes it began with silence. A battlefield littered with broken weapons, the dust still settling, the cries of the wounded fading into the distance. Amid the wreckage, survivors were rounded up by Assyrian soldiers. Spears pointed them into lines. Hands were bound, feet shackled, collars tightened around their necks. For many, this was the first time they realized their life was no longer their own. The Assyrians were meticulous. Prisoners were counted, recorded, sorted. High-ranking captives, generals, rulers, nobles were set aside. These were valuable prizes to be displayed in triumph. Ordinary soldiers were bound together in long chains, dragged forward in groups. Civilians' families with children clinging to their mothers were herded like cattle, pushed into columns stretching for miles. What awaited them next was not death, but humiliation. The Assyrians believed victory had to be seen, not just heard about. And so, when prisoners were taken, they were paraded before the king and the army. Relief carvings, still preserved in museums today, show lines of captives kneeling low, their arms twisted behind their backs, their faces forced downward in submission. Some were made to march naked, stripped of clothing as a symbol of defeat. Others were forced to carry the spoils of their own cities, jars of grain, treasure, even the statues of their gods. Imagine the pain of carrying the image of your own deity, once sacred in your temple, now dragged before a foreign king as loot. For the Assyrians, this was more than cruelty. It was political theater, a performance designed to send a message. This is what happens to those who resist. But the humiliation was not temporary. Once the ceremonies ended, the prisoners' ordeal had only just begun. They were forced into long marches, sometimes hundreds of miles across scorching deserts or rugged mountains. Food was scarce, water rationed. Those who stumbled were beaten. Those who fell were left behind. A Babylonian tablet once described these marches in chilling simplicity. The people went weeping, their feet bleeding on the road, their bodies broken. It was not exaggeration. It was daily reality. For the fullest captives, each step carried them farther from home, deeper into a world they could not yet imagine. The gates of Assyria loomed ahead, and with them, a new life of servitude and suffering. But at this stage, just after capture, before the true horrors of captivity, there was something even heavier than the chains themselves. Uncertainty. Not knowing whether they would live or die, whether they would serve as slaves, or be executed as an example, thought it was the beginning of a nightmare that seemed endless. Chapter 2, Part 2. The Theater of Victory. Capture alone was not enough. In Assyria, victory had to be seen, heard, and remembered. Every triumph was transformed into a public ritual, a theater of power that left no doubt about who ruled and who obeyed. When an Assyrian army returned from campaign, the streets of the capital filled with anticipation. Imagine the scene. Citizens lining the avenues, soldiers marching in disciplined ranks, musicians beating drums and blowing long, deep horns. At the center of it all came the captives, the living trophies of conquest. They were paraded in chains, their hands bound, their necks fastened with ropes or wooden yokes. Some had rings pierced through their lips or noses, symbols of total submission. Relief carvings show them stooped low, heads bowed, dragged forward by soldiers. The Assyrians believed this spectacle served a higher purpose. To them, it was not only a display for human eyes, but also for the gods. At the head of the procession stood the king, chosen of Ashur, the chief god of Assyria. Behind him marched priests carrying sacred emblems. The message was clear. Every victory, every prisoner, was proof that Ashur's will had been fulfilled. inscriptions describe how entire foreign kings were forced to kneel before the Assyrian monarch. Their crowns and royal garments were stripped away. Sometimes they were chained at the city gates, left on display for days. Others were brought into the great palaces of Nineveh or Nimrud, where they bowed at the feet of the Assyrian king, while scribes recorded their names for posterity. But it was not just rulers. Ordinary captives, too, became part of the ritual. Some were made to carry heavy loads during the procession stone slabs, jars of tribute, even the statues of their defeated gods. For the Assyrians, forcing prisoners to humiliate their own deities was the ultimate sign of conquest. Imagine carrying a sacred statue, once worshipped in your temple, now reduced to plunder in a foreign parade. The victory ritual was designed to send a message far beyond the city walls. Carved into palace reliefs and inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets, these processions became eternal propaganda. Anyone who entered the royal halls could see the scenes of humiliation, prisoners kneeling, kings in chains, heads of rebels displayed like trophies. The walls themselves whispered, "This is Assyria. This is your fate if you resist." And for the prisoners themselves, this was the moment they realized their suffering had only just begun. Their humiliation was not a passing show. It was the opening act of a long ordeal. After the parade, they would be sent on the road into exile, scattered across the empire to live out lives of servitude. The applause of the crowd faded, the drums grew quiet, and the chains remained. Chapter 2, Part 3. The march into exile. Once the celebrations were over, the real suffering began. For prisoners of war, captivity was not a single moment, it was a journey. A journey that stretched for weeks, even months, across landscapes. As unforgiving as the Assyrian soldiers who drove them forward. The captives were herded into long lines, shackled together with ropes or wooden yokes. Relief carvings show them walking in groups, their hands bound behind their backs, ropes fastened to collars around their necks. Some were led by hooks pierced through their lips, a detail so cruel it seems unthinkable, yet it was carefully recorded by Assyrian artists, meant to terrify anyone who looked upon it. The roads were harsh. Many deportations covered hundreds of miles from the rugged hills of Anatolia, across the scorching Syrian desert, down into the plains of Mesopotamia. The prisoners walked barefoot. Their feet bled on the sharp stones. Their backs bent under the weight of whatever loads they were forced to carry. Food was scarce. Rations were handed out sparingly: barley, dried dates, perhaps a skin of water. Some collapsed under the heat of the sun. Those who faltered were whipped, pushed forward, or simply abandoned to die along the road. To the Assyrians, each body left behind was a warning to the rest. Keep moving, or share their fate. But it was not only soldiers and men of fighting age who walked these roads. Families were taken too. Mothers carrying infants, children clinging to the hems of their mothers' robes, the elderly leaning on staffs as they tried to keep pace. Imagine the silence of a child too tired to cry, eyes glazed from thirst, carried mile after mile toward an unknown land. Clay tablets sometimes record these events in chillingly simple lines. I carried off the people, their men, their women, their children, countless in number. I settled them in Assyria. No mention of suffering, no description of loss, just numbers, reduced to cargo in the great machinery of empire. For the captives themselves, the march was endless. Every horizon promised rest, yet brought only more dust, more heat, more miles. The memory of their homes grew distant. Fields once green, temples once sacred, the laughter of neighbors, these were left behind, traded for a road that led only deeper into Assyria's grasp. And when, at last, the march ended, the captives did not find freedom. At the gates of Assyrian cities, they faced new divisions. Who would live, who would serve, and who would die? But in those endless days on the road, what weighed heavier than the chains was uncertainty. Not knowing where the journey would end. Not knowing if it would ever end at all. Chapter 2, Part 4. Judgment at the gates of Assyria. The marshes ended not with freedom, but with a reckoning. After days, weeks, sometimes months on the road, the prisoners reached the gates of Assyria's great cities, Nineveh, Calhu, or Ashur. Towering walls loomed above them, carved with images of winged bulls and stern kings. To the weary eyes of captives, these gates must have seemed like the threshold to another world. Here, decisions were made. Not every prisoner shared the same fate. High-ranking captives, the kings, generals, nobles of fallen nations, were brought directly before the Assyrian monarch. In the grand courtyards of palaces, they were forced to kneel at his feet. Some were spared, allowed to live as vassals under strict watch, their loyalty bought with humiliation. Others were executed in public, their deaths carved into stone. Reliefs for future generations to see. The message was unmistakable. No ruler could defy Assyria and remain proud. For ordinary soldiers, judgment was harsher still. Many were conscripted into the Assyrian army itself. Imagine being forced to fight under the banner of the very empire that had destroyed your homeland. Others were marked as laborers, their strength redirected to construction projects, raising walls, digging canals, or hauling stone for the empire's monumental palaces. Civilians faced another destiny: dispersal. Families were broken apart, scattered across the empire's provinces. This was not random. The Assyrians deliberately resettled populations far from their native soil to weaken rebellion. A farmer from Syria might find himself in Assyria's eastern highlands, while artisans from Anatolia were sent to Babylonian cities. Each person was a pawn, relocated where the empire needed labor most dot, and then there were those who did not survive judgment at all. Assyrian texts, grim in their pride, describe captives impaled on stakes or flayed alive, their skins displayed on city walls. These executions were not only punishments, but performances, warnings carved deep into the memory of all who entered the city. Yet not all stories ended in cruelty. Some prisoners, especially those with valuable skills, scribes, doctors, craftsmen, were absorbed into Assyrian society. Their talents were too precious to waste. They became servants in noble households, artisans in royal workshops, or advisors in the court. Still, even in privilege, they lived under the shadow of conquest, forever marked as outsiders. For every captive, whether noble or commoner, soldier or child, judgment at the gates of Assyria was the moment their old life ended. Homes were gone. Freedom was gone. Their names, in many cases, forgotten. What remained was survival under the empire's gaze. Chapter 3, Part 1. Punishments. Carved in stone. The Assyrians understood something profound about fear. It lasts longer when it is remembered. And so, their punishments were not only carried out, they were recorded. Carved into palace walls, written onto clay tablets, etched into the very stones of their cities. Walk through the ruins of Nineveh or Calhu today, and you will see them. Reliefs showing prisoners impaled on tall stakes, their bodies twisted in agony, displayed outside city walls like grotesque scarecrows. Others show men being flayed alive, their skins carefully peeled away, stretched, and hung like banners for all to see. It is shocking, even to modern eyes. But to the Assyrians, this was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was strategy. The Assyrian kings wrote about these acts proudly in their inscriptions. One king boasted, "I flayed the nobles as an example. I covered the city walls with their skins." Another claimed, "I impaled captives around the city. I left their bodies to rot in the sun." These were not secret crimes. They were deliberate announcements, intended to terrify both subjects and enemies alike. But why? Because fear was a weapon as sharp as any sword. The Assyrians ruled an empire that stretched across deserts, mountains, and rivers, filled with rebellious cities and restless tribes. It was impossible to control them all by force alone. But if fear spread faster than soldiers could march, resistance might die before it even began. And so the punishments became theater. Executions were staged in public squares, before crowds, of both Assyrians and captives. Children and families of prisoners were sometimes forced to watch, the memory seared into their minds. The message was clear. This is not only your fate. It could be theirs as well. It is easy to imagine the silence of a conquered crowd, standing before a wall lined with impaled bodies. The smell of blood and sun-baked flesh lingering in the air. The cries of the condemned mixing with the chants of soldiers praising the king's justice. Even the choice of punishment carried meaning. Impalement was a symbol of total domination. The body left exposed, powerless, a warning to all. Flaying was worse. The victim stripped not only of life, but of identity, their very skin displayed as proof of defeat. Decapitation was common too. Heads of rebels were piled at city gates or sent as trophies back to Assyria's capitals. And yet, as brutal as these punishments were, they were carefully calculated. The Assyrians did not kill every prisoner. Many more were spared, sent into exile, or used as slaves. Terror was most effective when balanced. Kill enough to frighten, spare enough to keep the empire running. This was Assyrian justice. Part religion, part politics, part raw violence. And for those captured on the battlefield, it was the fear of these punishments that haunted them most. To be marched in chains was terrible, but to see a fellow prisoner flayed alive or hoisted on a stake was to glimpse the darkest face of Assyria. Chapter 3, Part 2. The psychology of fear. The Assyrians were not cruel by accident. Their violence was not random, nor was it hidden away in shame. It was deliberate, calculated, and displayed for maximum effect. They understood something that modern rulers, generals, and even propagandists would later rediscover. Fear travels faster than armies. Imagine you are a villager in a small city on the border of Assyria's empire. You have never seen an Assyrian soldier, but you have heard the stories. Travelers whisper of cities burned, of kings humiliated, of prisoners impaled on stakes so high they can be seen for miles. These stories spread from mouth to mouth, faster than soldiers could march. By the time Assyria's army approaches, your people are already trembling. Some cities surrendered without a fight, simply because the fear of resistance was greater than the hope of victory. This was no accident. The Assyrian kings themselves recorded their acts of cruelty in vivid detail, knowing these records would circulate. They ordered their scribes to carve punishments onto palace walls and inscribe them on clay tablets. When visiting envoys entered Nineveh, Akahu, they walked past endless rows of stone reliefs showing the broken bodies of enemies. The walls themselves became instruments of terror. It is important to understand the role of propaganda here. The Assyrians did not simply kill. They advertised killing. Every impalement was a billboard. Every flaying was a message. Every chained king was an image meant to echo across the empire. This created what historians call a psychological multiplier effect. For every one man executed, 100 more trembled at the thought. For every city punished, 10 more considered surrender before the Assyrian army even arrived. Terror was efficient. It saved time, resources, and soldiers' lives. But fear worked in more subtle ways too. For prisoners themselves, watching fellow captives suffer was a form of control. A man who has seen his comrade impaled is less likely to resist, less likely to run, less likely to dream of rebellion. A child who has seen her father humiliated before the Assyrian king grows up with submission carved into her memory. We might call this psychological warfare today. The Assyrians would not have used that phrase, of course, but they practiced it with ruthless skill. They turned human suffering into a spectacle that could outlast a battle, outlive a campaign, and echo for generations. And it worked. For nearly 3 centuries, Assyria dominated the Near East, not only because of iron weapons and disciplined armies, but because their enemies believed resistance was hopeless. Fear became the invisible weapon in every conquest. Still, the cost was immense. Empires built on terror may last for a time, but they also create deep hatred. The same fear that silenced people also hardened them, waiting for the moment when Assyria weakened, when the chains could be broken. But that part of the story comes later. For now, imagine the silence after a public execution, the crowd dispersing, the chains rattling as prisoners are led away. The memory of what they had seen lingered in every heart. That memory was the true weapon of Assyria. Chapter 3. Part 3. Punishment as public theater in the Assyrian world. Punishment was never hidden. It was staged. It was choreographed. It was theater on the grandest stage possible, the city itself. When a city rebelled, its fate became a lesson. Captives were not executed in silence behind palace walls. They were marched into public squares, bound and broken, set before the eyes of both conqueror and conquered. Soldiers, citizens, priests, even children gathered to watch. Everyone had a role: the victim, the king, the crowd. The purpose was not justice. It was performance. Imagine the scene: a wooden platform in the shadow of a towering ziggurat. The Assyrian king seated on a throne, surrounded by priests of Ashur, his soldiers standing in disciplined ranks. Before him, captives are brought forth. Perhaps a defeated king, perhaps rebellious nobles. The punishment is carried out slowly, deliberately, each act designed to leave an impression. When impalement took place, the crowd gasped, but they did not turn away. They were meant to see. The tall wooden stakes rose above the crowd, the bodies lifted into the sky, visible even from beyond the city walls. When flaying was performed, the executioners worked with grim skill, peeling skin from flesh, displaying it like a banner. The horror was unforgettable, and that was the point. The ceremonies were often accompanied by words. Royal inscriptions carved afterward tell us that the king addressed the people, reminding them that this was divine justice, the will of Ashur carried out through his chosen ruler. To disobey the Assyrian king was not just rebellion against a man, but blasphemy against a god. Music sometimes filled the air: drums, horns, the chants of priests, blending victory with violence, ritual with cruelty. The line between religion, politics, and punishment dissolved. For the Assyrians, they were all one. And the audience? They absorbed the message in silence. Citizens of Assyria saw the king's power confirmed. Conquered people saw the price of resistance. Prisoners awaiting their fate saw a vision of what might soon come for them. This was punishment transformed into spectacle, cruelty into performance. By making executions a theater, the Assyrians ensured they would live on in memory, long after the victims were gone. Even today, thousands of years later, we can still see these performances through the reliefs left behind. Stone panels depicting rows of impaled men, prisoners in chains, kings groveling at the feet of Assyrian monarchs. The stage may have vanished, but the theater remains, frozen in stone. For the prisoners, though, this was no metaphor. It was their reality. To them, the performance was not symbolic. It was life ending in agony, displayed for all to see. Chapter 3, Part 4. Propaganda and Reality. When we read the records of Assyria today, or look upon the carved reliefs of their palaces, it is easy to imagine a world drenched in blood, endless impalements, mass executions, cruelty beyond measure. But history is rarely so simple. Between the stone and the truth lies a space where propaganda lives. The Assyrian kings love to boast. Their inscriptions, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, often exaggerated numbers. A king might claim he captured tens of thousands of prisoners, though in reality, the number may have been far smaller. A single rebellion might be described as if it shook the entire world simply to glorify the king's victory. The same was true of punishments. The reliefs show horrific scenes of flaying, impalement, decapitation. But did every conquered city suffer this fate? Probably not. Scholars believe many of these images were symbolic, designed less to record daily events and more to intimidate future enemies. It was theater carved into stone, propaganda that outlived the moment. In truth, most prisoners were not killed. They were resettled, forced into exile, made to work as farmers, builders, or servants. Their lives were harsh, but they were lives nonetheless. The empire needed labor far more than it needed corpses. So why the exaggeration? Because fear was a weapon. A king who flayed one rebel could claim to have flayed an entire city. A single execution could be carved into stone as if it represented hundreds. And once that image was seen by envoys, merchants, and travelers, it would spread like wildfire. Neighboring kings, hearing of Assyrian cruelty, might surrender without a fight. The propaganda had achieved its purpose. It is worth remembering, too, that the reliefs we see today were displayed inside royal palaces. They were not just warnings to foreigners, but reminders to Assyria's own citizens. Walking through the halls of Nineveh, a noble or official would see, carved into the walls, proof that the king was strong, ruthless, favored by the gods. The message was not only for the outside world, it was for the empire itself. Reality, then, was a mixture. Yes, Assyria was brutal, and yes, their punishments were real. But the scale was magnified by propaganda. The suffering of some was displayed as if it were the fate of all. The horror of a few became the legend of many. And, in this blending of truth and exaggeration, fear found its greatest power. Even if you had never seen an Assyrian soldier, never witnessed an execution, the stories alone were enough to bend your will. For the prisoners, though, propaganda and reality were one and the same. Whether their fate was death on a stake or life in exile, they lived under the shadow of fear. And that shadow stretched far beyond the walls of Assyria, casting darkness over every land the empire touched. Chapter 4, Part 1. Forced labor and the building of an empire when the parades ended, when the punishments were over, and when the judgments had been made. Most prisoners of war faced a different kind of suffering. They were not executed. They were not set free. Instead, they were folded into the endless machinery of Assyria's empire as forced laborers. The Assyrians were master builders. They raised towering city walls, sprawling palaces, and vast irrigation systems that turned dry plains into fertile farmland. But none of this was achieved by free hands alone. It was the captives, the conquered, who carried the stones, dug the canals, and laid the bricks. Imagine the scene. Long lines of prisoners hauling massive blocks of limestone under the burning Mesopotamian sun. Some pushed carts laden with clay bricks, while others lifted baskets of dirt to build raised platforms for temples and ziggurats. Overseers stood above them with whips, shouting commands in a language the captives did not understand. The scale of these projects was enormous. In Nineveh, the great capital, King Sennacherib ordered the construction of walls so thick that chariots could ride across their tops. He also commanded the building of aqueducts, giant stone channels that carried water from distant mountains into the city. Who built them? Not Assyrian citizens, but prisoners of war. Their sweat, their labor, Their lives were poured into the stones that still stand today. The captives' work was not limited to monuments. They dug canals to expand agriculture, turning barren fields into farmland to feed the empire. They built roads paved with stone, linking distant provinces to the Assyrian heartland. In many ways, it was the toil of prisoners that allowed Assyria to grow from a kingdom into an empire. Conditions were brutal. Prisoners worked from sunrise to sunset with little rest. Food was rationed. Barley porridge, onions, sometimes dried. Dates. Water was scarce, especially in the heat of summer. Many collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies simply replaced by new captives from the next campaign. And yet, not all captives were treated the same. Skilled laborers, stonemasons, carpenters, metalworkers often fared slightly better. They were assigned to workshops within the cities, producing weapons, tools, or decorative carvings for palaces. Their work was still forced, their freedom still gone, but their skills kept them alive. The irony is striking. The very monuments that glorified Assyrian kings, the towering palaces, the carved reliefs showing their victories, were built by the very people they had conquered. Prisoners of war created the images of their own defeat. To walk the streets of Nineveh in those days was to see the labor of many nations woven into the empire's fabric. Prisoners from Elam, Babylon, Israel, Aram, Urartu all spoke different tongues, but all bent their backs under the same Assyrian yoke. For them, daily life was not defined by grand moments of history, but by the rhythm of endless labor. The weight of stone on their shoulders, the sting of the whip on their backs, and the slow erosion of hope. Chapter 4, Part 2. Slaves in the house of Assyria. Not every prisoner was marched to the fields or the construction sites. Some were taken into the very heart of Assyrian society, into the homes of nobles, priests, and wealthy families. There, they lived not under the open sun, but behind walls, serving as domestic slaves. At first glance, this fate may have seemed easier than hauling stones or digging canals. A slave in a household might work indoors, sheltered from the burning heat. They prepared food, ground grain, carried water, cleaned courtyards, and tended animals. Women were often forced into weaving, spinning wool into cloth, or serving as attendants to their mistress. Children, too, could be pressed into service, carrying small loads, sweeping floors, or even playing the role of companions for Assyrian children. But the walls of a house did not mean safety. Domestic slaves lived under constant surveillance. They could be beaten for the smallest mistakes. They ate last, after their masters had finished, surviving on scraps. They slept on mats in corners, in storage rooms, or near the animals they cared for. And above all, they were always reminded they were property. The Assyrians kept careful records, and clay tablets sometimes list slaves by name. Many of these names were foreign, evidence that they had once belonged to conquered peoples. To see one's name reduced to a line on a tablet, valued like livestock or furniture, was to feel the weight of captivity, not only in body, but in identity. Household slaves were also vulnerable in other ways. Women could be forced into concubinage, serving the desires of their masters with no choice of their own. Children born from such unions were sometimes absorbed into the household, but more often they too became property, bound by chains their mothers could never break. Yet within this grim reality, there were layers of complexity. A skilled household slave, one who could cook elaborate meals, play a musical instrument, or write in cuneiform, might earn a degree of trust. Some were placed in charge of other servants, overseeing the work of the less skilled. These privileges did not erase their status as captives, but they did offer survival in a world that offered little mercy. And so, within Assyrian houses, daily life for prisoners became a rhythm of obedience. The clatter of grinding stones in the kitchen, the creak of water jars carried from the well, the soft hum of women weaving at looms. Beneath it all lay silence, the silence of submission, the silence of lives reshaped by conquest. It is haunting to imagine, in the grand palaces of Nineveh, while kings plotted new campaigns and nobles feasted on roasted lamb and wine, the invisible hands of prisoners kept everything running. Their voices were hushed, their names forgotten, but without them, the empire's luxury could not exist. For those captives, survival meant endurance. Day by day, task by task, they lived in the shadow of their masters, their own pasts fading, like a dream they could never return to. Chapter 4, Part 3. The Skilled Captives. Not all captives swung hammers or hauled stones. Among the thousands taken in Assyrian campaigns were men and women whose skills made them too valuable for rough labor. These were the artisans, scribes, musicians, and craftsmen, the talented hands and minds of conquered nations. The Assyrians understood the worth of these people. A stonemason from Syria, a bronzesmith from Anatolia, a musician from Babylon. Such individuals were treasures in their own way. Rather than being sent to dig canals, they were absorbed into workshops, temples, and palaces where their talents served the empire directly. Inside the royal workshops of Nineveh and Kalhu, one might see rows of foreign artisans carving intricate reliefs into slabs of limestone. These were the very images that glorified Assyrian kings. Scenes of battles, parades of prisoners, winged guardians towering above palace doorways. Ironically, many of the hands that carved these images belonged to prisoners, forced to immortalize the very victories that had enslaved them. Scribes, too, were highly prized. Cuneiform writing, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets, required years of training. If a conquered land produced scribes, the Assyrians often spared them, putting them to work in administrative offices. Imagine a man once serving a Babylonian temple, now bent over a clay tablet in Nineveh, recording lists of tribute, taxes, and deportations for his Assyrian overlords. His skills ensured his survival, but each mark he pressed into the clay was another reminder of the empire that had broken his freedom. Musicians and entertainers were also taken. Royal courts valued music. Harps, drums, and flutes played during feasts and ceremonies. Some prisoners found themselves performing in front of the same king whose armies had destroyed their homeland. It is difficult to imagine the emotions they carried, their songs filling the halls of power while their hearts longed for distant homes. Yet, even in this role, life was not easy. Skilled captives were still slaves, bound to their masters. Their survival depended on their usefulness. A mistake, a decline in skill, or simple bad fortune could strip away their privileges, sending them back to harsher labor. And yet, these individuals played a hidden role in the cultural fabric of Assyria by bringing in artisans and intellectuals. From across the Near East, the empire became a crossroads of knowledge and art. The libraries of Assyrian kings, filled with thousands of tablets, contained not only Assyrian records but works copied from Babylon, Sumer, and beyond. Many of those texts might never have survived if not for the captive scribes who preserved them. There is a quiet irony here. While Assyria sought to dominate through conquest, it also became a vessel for preserving the skills, stories, and artistry of the very peoples it conquered. Prisoners, stripped of freedom, still carried fragments of their cultures into the empire, leaving traces that endured long after Assyria itself fell. For the skilled captives, daily life was a delicate balance. They were valued yet powerless, privileged yet enslaved. Their tools, chisels, styluses, instruments, were both instruments of survival and chains of service. And while their hands shaped Assyria's greatness, their hearts remained bound to homelands they would never see again. Chapter 4, Part 4. Lives in the shadows beyond the noise of construction sites and the bustle of noble households, there existed another world. the hidden lives of the captives themselves. It was a world of shadows, lived in corners and margins, yet filled with small moments that gave meaning to survival. Prisoners did not stop being human when they were chained. Families tried to stay together when they could, though deportations often tore them apart. In Assyrian records, we sometimes see lists of deportees, grouped by families, husband, wife, children. It suggests that even in the cold calculations of empire, there were glimpses of ordinary bonds. Bonds the captives clung to desperately. For many, daily life was a search for endurance. After long hours of forced labor, prisoners gathered in makeshift quarters, often on the edges of towns or near construction sites. They shared food, told stories in their native tongues, and sang songs that reminded them of home. These quiet rituals were fragile acts of resistance, ways of holding on to memory in a world that tried to erase it. Children, especially, carried both burden and hope. Some grew up never knowing the lands their parents had come from. To them, Assyria was the only home they remembered. They spoke Assyrian, worked in Assyrian households, and became absorbed into the empire's culture. Yet, through lullabies, traditions, and whispered tales, fragments of their ancestors' identity survived. There were also sparks of unexpected resilience. Skilled captives sometimes passed on knowledge to one another, teaching trades or crafts in secret. Farmers learned new irrigation methods from the Assyrians, while Assyrians, in turn, absorbed farming techniques from their captives. Cultures mixed quietly in fields, workshops, and kitchens, blending into something larger than either conqueror or conquered had planned. Still, the shadow of loss was ever present. Many captives never saw their homeland again. Their memories grew dim, like smoke fading into night air. For some, hope dwindled until only routine remained. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Survival became its own kind of quiet triumph. And yet, within these hidden corners of captivity, humanity endured. A mother humming to her child after a day of toil. A father teaching his son to shape clay into a vessel. An old man recalling the names of rivers and mountains his grandchildren would never see. These were the small lights that flickered in the darkness of empire. Assyria's kings carved their victories in stone, boasting of terror and domination. But the prisoners left no such monuments. Their stories were not written on tablets or walls. They lived in whispers, in gestures, in fleeting memories. And though history records them only faintly, their presence was the heartbeat of the empire. Silent, hidden, but unbroken. Chapter 5, Part 1. Prisoners in Art and Memory. If you walk today among the ruins of Assyria's great cities, Nineveh, Kalhu, or Dur-Sharrukin, you will find silence. The palaces are broken, their walls collapsed, their kings long forgotten. Yet carved into fallen slabs of stone, the voices of prisoners still remain. The Assyrians filled there. Palaces with reliefs, long panels of carved stone depicting scenes of conquest. These images were not random decoration. They were carefully chosen memories, crafted to show the power of the king and the submission of his enemies. And at the center of many of these images are the prisoners. We see them bound in chains, heads bowed. We see long lines of men, women, and children, walking in sorrow as they are led into exile. We see defeated kings kneeling, their crowns cast aside, their hands lifted in desperate supplication. These carvings were more than art. They were messages in stone, designed to echo across time to the Assyrian court. These images were a celebration. They told visitors that Assyria's power was absolute, that the king's enemies had no choice but to submit. Every panel was a record of divine favor, proof that the god Ashur had granted victory. But to us, thousands of years later, they tell a different story. They reveal the suffering of the captives, preserved unintentionally by the very empire that enslaved them. Each carved figure is a silent testimony, not of glory, but of loss. Cuneiform inscriptions reinforce this picture. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Sennacherib recorded, in chilling pride, the numbers of prisoners taken, the lands emptied, the people resettled. I carried away their men and women, countless in number, one inscription declares. To the king, they were statistics, symbols of conquest. To us, they are fragments of human lives reduced to lines on clay. What is striking is how central the image of the prisoner was to Assyrian self-identity. The empire defined itself not only by who it was, but by who it had conquered. The bound captive, carved again and again into palace walls, became almost a symbol of Assyria itself. Without prisoners, there could be no proof of power, and so the prisoners entered memory, not by their own voices, but through the hands of their captors. Their chains, their bowed heads, their silent marches are still visible today, long after. The empire that enslaved them has vanished. It is a haunting irony. The Assyrians meant these carvings to glorify themselves, to intimidate their enemies. But thousands of years later, it is the captives we remember most clearly. Their suffering, carved into stone, outlasted the kings who ordered the carvings. The prisoners became eternal, their silent images whispering through the ruins. Chapter 5, Part 2. Society shaped by captivity. Assyria was more than an empire of walls and weapons. It was an empire of people. People displaced, scattered, resettled. Captivity was not just a fate for individuals. It was a policy that reshaped entire societies. The Assyrians understood that conquering land was never enough. Land without people is empty. What they wanted was control over both. And so, when they captured a city, they carried its people away, transplanting them like trees, pulled from one soil and planted in another. This policy of mass deportation became a signature of Assyrian rule. Populations were uprooted and marched across deserts, rivers, and mountains. Farmers from one region were resettled in another. Skilled artisans were scattered among Assyrian cities. Whole communities were broken apart, their identities dissolved into the empire's greater whole. For Assyria, the benefits were many. Deportations weakened the conquered. A people removed from their homeland could not easily rebel. By scattering them, the Assyrians cut the roots of resistance. At the same time, they enriched their own heartland, filling their cities with new laborers, craftsmen, and servants. The result was a society shaped by captivity. Walk the streets of Nineveh in its height, and you would hear many tongues: Aramaic, Babylonian, Hebrew, Eurasian. Prisoners brought their languages, their crafts, their traditions. Assyria became a crossroads of cultures, not by choice, but by conquest. For the prisoners, though, this mixing was bittersweet. Their identities were slowly eroded. Children grew up speaking Assyrian, working Assyrian fields, worshipping Assyrian gods. Yet in whispered songs, in kitchen recipes, in small household rituals, traces of their former lives survived. Captivity both destroyed and preserved, silencing voices, even as it carried fragments of them forward into history. The presence of prisoners also shaped Assyrian society itself. Free citizens saw them everywhere, in fields, in workshops, in homes. Their labor freed Assyrian men for war and enriched the lives of Assyrian nobles. Yet, it also created dependence. The empire's greatness rested on the backs of those it had conquered. This system of control by captivity spread fear far beyond Assyria's borders. Neighboring states knew that to resist was to risk not only defeat but removal, the loss of land, family, and identity. In some cases, entire regions surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid the fate they had heard whispered in stories of captives chained and marched away. And so captivity became not only a punishment, but a pillar of empire. It reshaped societies, altered cultures, and left scars that lasted for generations. Even after Assyria itself fell, the memory of forced exile lingered in the stories of the peoples it displaced. For the prisoners, captivity was daily life. For Assyria, it was policy. For history, it was legacy. Chapter 5, Part 3. Comparisons across civilizations. Assyria's treatment of prisoners may sound uniquely brutal. The impalements, the flayings, the endless march into exile. But when we look across the ancient world, we find echoes. Conquest and captivity were woven into the fabric of many civilizations. What set Assyria apart was not only what they did, but how openly and proudly they displayed it. Consider Egypt. Pharaohs also paraded prisoners in triumph. On temple walls at Karnak and Luxor, we see bound captives, their arms tied behind them, kneeling before the pharaoh. Yet Egyptian art often portrayed this in a symbolic way. Endless rows of prisoners representing foreign nations rather than specific individuals. Egypt celebrated conquest, but rarely described the intimate details of cruelty in the way Assyria did dot in Babylon. Prisoners were often absorbed into society, much as in Assyria. Deportations occurred there too. Most famously, the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people in the 6th century BCE. Babylonian rulers valued skilled captives, resettling them in cities where their talents could serve the state. Their methods were harsh, but not usually accompanied by the graphic theater of terror that Assyria preferred. The Greeks, centuries later, also enslaved the defeated. After battles, survivors were sold in markets as war captives. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, was built on the labor of slaves, many of whom were prisoners of war. The cruelty was there, but cloaked in economic routine rather than carved into palace walls. Even the Romans, who rose long after Assyria had fallen, echoed this pattern. Roman triumphal parades featured chained prisoners, marching through the streets of Rome. Defeated kings and generals were displayed, then executed or imprisoned for life. Slaves from conquered lands filled Roman households and fields. Yet again, what differed was emphasis. Rome glorified victory. Assyria glorified fear. What truly distinguished Assyria was its candor. Where others veiled their cruelty behind symbols or silence, Assyria proclaimed it. They wanted the world to know. Every carved relief, every bloody inscription was a deliberate act of communication. It was as if the Assyrians said, "We are not only strong, we are terrifying. And if you resist, this will be you." In this way, Assyria foreshadowed later empires, but carried terror further, wielding it as both weapon and advertisement. Their methods shocked even their neighbors, leaving a reputation that endured long after their cities lay in ruins. So, while Assyria was not alone in enslaving or deporting captives, it was unmatched in turning cruelty into spectacle and spectacle into policy. Their empire was built not only on iron and blood, but on memory. The memories of those who heard the stories, saw the reliefs, or witnessed the prisoners in chains. And it is that memory, more than the acts themselves, that shaped histories. View of Assyria, the Empire of Fear, Chapter 5, Part 4. Lessons from Assyria's captives. The story of Assyria's prisoners is not just about the past. It is also about power, about fear, and about what it means to be human in the face of empire. Assyria rose higher than almost any kingdom before it. Its kings commanded armies of iron. Its walls towered over the Mesopotamian plain. Its palaces gleamed with the labor of countless captives. But for all its might, Assyria built its strength on fragile foundations, on fear and suffering. Fear is a powerful tool. It can silence rebellion, crush resistance, and hold empires together. But it also creates hatred, resentment, and the quiet wish for revenge. The very captives who labored to raise Assyria's monuments carried with them memories of loss. Their children inherited those memories, whispering them into the future. And when Assyria finally faltered, its enemies struck with fury, tearing down the empire that had once seemed eternal. What remains today are ruins. The palaces have crumbled, the armies have vanished, and the king's names are known only to historians. But the prisoners, nameless, faceless, voiceless in their time, still speak. Their chains echo in the stone reliefs, their exile lingers in ancient inscriptions. Their suffering shadows the memory of Assyria itself. From them, we learn that no empire lasts forever. Power built on cruelty may shine brightly for a time, but it burns itself out. Fear can control bodies, but it cannot conquer the human spirit. Even in captivity, people found ways to endure, in whispered songs, in family bonds, in the skills they passed on, in the fragments of culture they carried across deserts and mountains. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: the greatness of a civilization is not measured only by its kings, its walls, or its armies. It is measured by how it treats the most powerless in its grasp. Assyria left us magnificent ruins, but it also left us a warning that glory without mercy crumbles, and that cruelty, no matter how carefully carved in stone, cannot outlast. Compassion. So, as we close this story, let the voices of the forgotten stay with us. The men and women who walked in chains, who built with their hands what others claimed as glory, who endured the shadow of empire. Their names are lost, but their humanity remains. And now, as you drift into rest, let their story fade into silence. The Assyrians are gone, their empire's dust. What lingers is the lesson that in the end, it is not fear, but endurance that survives.